Real Canadian news, real Canadian news, real Canadian news.
Hello everyone and welcome back to RCN, Real Canadian News. This is your host Kelly Develay. Today we're going to be talking about an important issue in Canada's history and in contemporary society today. The issue we're going to be speaking about is how nationalism is impacted by the Indian Act and by treaties. But first, let's start off with some definitions. If you guys don't know, treaties are an agreement made between First Nations peoples and the Canadian government and Crown. What many of you guys might not know is that when treaties were first made, they weren't properly explained to Indigenous peoples. So the problem is that when Indigenous peoples did agree to them, they didn't know what they were getting themselves into, and that put them at a disadvantage. That disadvantage can still be experienced today. The Indian Act gave authority to the Department of Indian Affairs. They helped manage who and who wasn't status Indian, and they also manage Indigenous people's money and resources. The reason that this department was created is because Canada at the time did not believe that Indigenous peoples could manage their own affairs and govern themselves. This act was made to promote civilization through assimilation. Even though the act had a pretty bad beginning, it still holds weight in today's laws. At the time, Canada's government did not believe in Indigenous people having their own culture because there were Eurocentric standards. Now we're going to move on to our next segment where Sophia is going to be talking about the numbered treaties more in depth.
Thank you, Kelly. Now we're going to be talking about numbered treaties. There are two types of treaties, historic and modern. Historic treaties was when the treaties were first signed by the Crown and the First Nations peoples between 1971 and 1923. Modern treaties is today when those agreements were associated since then. Treaties have been used to settle land disputes and wars and even establish new countries. Off to you, Rosamia.
Thank you, Sophia. The Indian Act was passed in 1868 and 1867. The Indian Act was amended in 1951 in an attempt to roll back some harsh impositions of the Act.
Now I'm going to be explaining the influence of the Indian Act and the numbered treaties on Canadian nationalism and their political and economic impact. Let's start off with the political impact. Treaties today are what dictate Canada's relationship with its Indigenous people. But they're still kind of controversial because at the time the Indigenous people signed into the treaties, they weren't properly educated on what the treaties would mean for them, and so they were put at a disadvantage that they can still experience today. Now let's move on to the economic impact. Canada's government has attempted to take First Nations reserve land many times for economic gain. This has been at the cost of Indigenous people who use that land for other things. Some treaties also give First Nations peoples a monetary value for the Indigenous people to have. Though the economy inside the reserve is controlled by First Nations peoples, many argue that the Canadian government treats its reserves much more differently than it does the rest of Canada.
Now we're going to be talking about the social impact for both numbered treaties and the Indian Act. The creation of reserves, residential schools, and other instruments of assimilation used created a very heavy impact on the mental and physical health of the entire community. The situation was very harsh and caused trauma. Trauma was so abundant because of this that it caused intergenerational trauma.
Now we're going to be talking about the geographical impact of the Indian Act and numbered treaties. Obviously, they were split into 11 sections, one for each numbered treaty. First Nations groups are classified in numbered treaties and establishes what land they belong on. Due to the Continental Railway and the numbered treaties, Canada has also acquired more pieces of land, such as Alberta and Saskatchewan, and slowly expanded over time. And at the time, Canada isn't known for being pluralistic and a cultural mosaic.